What are the main issues that are expected to dominate at this year's G20?
Well, thanks for having me. The first and the priority will be the events of climate change or climate emergency, the fight against poverty and hunger, and the U20 consortium of big cities to try to develop sustainable cities. Those are the three principal parts of a viable G20 summit, and Brazil is trying to force this to establish a consensus over those three aspects.
Okay, we'll come back to climate change in just a moment. But how effective has the G20 been in recent times in addressing the big political crises like what's happening in the Middle East?
No, not effective at all, because G20 was thought to be a place, a special place for middle powers, like, for example, Egypt and Brazil and Turkey. And with the development of the BRICS, it became a middle term between the G7+1 and the BRICS. So I would say that the Brazilian diplomacy is trying hard to establish possible goals to be achieved by a consensus with G20, and also offering more places, like the place that is being offered to Qatar and Emirates to be part of the funding of those initiatives. But if we go to capacity of resolution, BRICS do have much more capacity of doing things together than G20.
Okay, that's very interesting. So you think that BRICS is more of a route for these kind of issues to be addressed rather than the G20. Let's come back to climate change then. Of course, we were just reporting that the president of COP29 has called on the G20 to address climate change. Do you think there's anything that the G20 can realistically do over the next couple of days?
The first point of all of it is trying to establish a global fund for the initiatives. We know by sure that with the new administration that is going back to Washington on January 20th the next year, they are all denialists, and they will do wherever they can to deny the climate change and the climate emergency. So we must establish a worldwide fund and accept that the new industrial projects must be green ones. And for given examples, the China development is being the China example is something to be copied. I would say so.
And what do you think holds back the G20? What are the problems? What are the issues and challenges that the G20 has in becoming effective?
The goal of the BRICS is to have a bank, the new development bank. The G20 will still operate inside of the post-Bretton Woods agreements, and this is a mistake. G20 should establish a global fund for the strategic goals of consensus. Otherwise, it will be a summit, and only an every year summit or every 2 year summit to talk things between middle powers and superpowers. Without a fund or a bank or a financial instrument to implement the changes that are being discussed in the summit, it will be much more a place to talk than a place to have decisions.
Okay, and by the end of this 2-day G20 summit, when they release the communique of what's been agreed, what do you expect to be in there?
The objective of this G20 being placed in Brazil, as long as the Brazilian diplomacy is trying hard to establish this, will be a global fund against poverty in Hungary, and this must be established with short-range chain of value for agriculture. So, talking in more simple words, agriculture with cheap cost, low cost, being produced by local peasants. Funding for climate change is starting with the U20 emergency for sustainable cities, because all of the biggest metropolitan areas and towns worldwide will be affected by the climate change. And then the climate change itself, or at least a fund to make sustainable the forest and the biomes of the world, especially the jungles and the forests, the tropical forests.